This video provides you with a quick introduction on how to use the results sheets to present and visualize your city's GHG emissions in a number of different ways. This section is where the outputs from the data can be found and where trends can be identified to support the setting of goals and tracking of emissions over time. The results section is also where net emissions targets can be monitored and historical inventories compared. The information presented in this tab can allow a city to begin interpreting their data and answering questions such as, what would an appropriate GHG reduction target be? Are we on track to meet our GHG reduction target? What sectors should policies be targeted at? The results section is composed of 5 sheets. These are summary, graphs, overview, analysis, and net emissions. The first sheet of the Results tab is the Summary sheet. This sheet features a high-level overview of your city's emissions and begins by summarising the city information, such as the inventory boundary, inventory year, and population. This allows for easy and quick comparability and benchmarking. It then shows emissions totals across scopes and sectors, as well as the cumulative total. First, we have to select which reporting level we want to view our data at by selecting from the drop-down list. This enables us to toggle between different views and to see how our data changes. In this example, we can see emissions have been reported in all sectors and at all reporting levels. A graph on the right-hand side of the page visualizes each sector total, allowing users to see their city's particular balance of emissions. Understanding this can be key in the process of goal and target setting and then tracking of change over time. It then also shows emissions intensity for the city derived by 3 categories: per capita, per unit land area, and per unit of GDP. The following sheet we can navigate to is the Graphs sheet. The Graphs sheet offers 4 visualizations of a city's data. These are pie charts comparing emissions by reporting level, Basic, Basic Plus, and Basic Plus and other Scope 3. A stacked bar chart of emissions by subsector and scope. A waterfall chart of emissions by Basic and Basic Plus and by subsector. And emissions by scope. This sheet offers the most detailed graphical breakdown of the results of the inventory, and therefore could be very useful for aiding communication of inventory results or reporting the headline results. These graphs can be copied and pasted from CIRIS. The overview sheet features a summary table of emissions, followed by a detailed breakdown of the results of the inventory. It shows a total value for each scope, inventory boundary, sector and subsector, as well as overall totals. This data is an example only. For example, we can see here that the Scope 1 emissions are the largest overall, and transportation is the largest sector here. But there is a significant contribution from electricity use in Scope 2 stationary sources. Waste is quite small, and there are no IPPU emissions reported. If we look at the detailed table below, we can see that commercial and institutional buildings are the largest Scope 1 fuel users, and transportation is dominated by on-road transport. IPPU emissions are not estimated here. In this case, we can see that 2 purple cells have not been completed, which means that this reporting has some omissions. So although the inventory is very complete, it cannot yet be called a Basic Plus inventory. We can also see that other Scope 3 emissions have been reported here and are very large, representing the wider footprint of our city. This level of detail allows a city to be more precise with their interpretation of emissions, develop targets around specific sources by their subsector, and communicate detail where necessary. For more information on the reporting framework, see Chapter 4 of the GPC. The following sheet we can navigate to is the Analysis sheet. This sheet allows a city to compare its current inventory against previous inventories. To enable this, previous inventory data needs to be manually added to CIRIS. This is done by simply copying and pasting data from this same page of a previous inventory into this inventory. The historical emissions table is then followed by 6 charts for each of the GPC sectors to facilitate sector emissions tracking against historical data. We can also select what we want to view on these graphs by selecting the inventory level, basic, basic plus, and territorial, and emissions type, total GHG, per capita, per unit land area, and per unit GDP, to compare inventories. If you have reported any emission credits, you can also view your inventories on a net emissions basis by switching View Total as Net Emissions on. The last sheet in the results section that we will now look at is for reporting such net emissions. This is where users can account for mechanisms they have used to indirectly reduce GHG emissions or to account for different calculation methodologies. There are 3 areas where cities may wish to report information relevant to their net emissions, and these are found in 3 sections on this sheet. These are, firstly, Scope 2 emissions based on the market-based method, where we can record the CO2e impact of any programs or investments, such as purchasing grid energy on green tariffs. We can add rows to the table to input information on the amount of energy and associated emissions. The example we are using here relates to renewable energy certificates from utility companies. We enter the quantity of energy under the scheme here, and the emission factor for the energy considering the renewable sources here. In the TCO2e column, we need to calculate the emissions manually. We then need to allocate these emissions to a sector. In this case, we will select stationary energy. The second way to report net emissions is through any offset credit transactions. The first table is for offsets generated and sold, and they are added to the total emissions in the total net emissions. The second table is for offsets purchased from outside, and they are deducted from the total in the total net emissions. Under Name of Program / Description, we enter a short overview of the offset credit program or transaction. We then enter the data of sale or retirement, followed by the amount of CO2e offset by the schemes in tonnes. As before, we need to allocate these emissions to a sector. In this case, we will select AFOLU and stationary energy. When more than one offset credit transaction is entered, the total emissions are summed in the grey cells. The third table is where a city can capture renewable production that otherwise only indirectly impacts Scope 2 emissions through a lower grid average emission factor, and that would not be visible in Scope 1 emissions for energy generation due to its zero emissions profile. Such emission reductions can occur within the city boundary or can reflect investments by the city outside the city boundary. Here, we'll add an example for capturing emission savings through the use of wind power. To start, we will add a row. Under technology type, we will enter wind power and the amount of energy generated. The wind farm that supplied this energy is outside of the city boundary, so select No, and we can say that 100% of the energy is generated outside of the city. To calculate avoided emissions as a result of renewable energy production, enter in the benchmark energy source column the energy source that is substituted by renewable energy. In this case, select grid-supplied energy. We then need to add the emission factor of the benchmark energy source specified in emission factor cells, ensuring the units match the activity data units. Enter the amount of reduction in emissions that have already been reflected in the gross emissions of your inventory via a lower grid emission factor. This is in order to avoid double counting. For more guidance on how to calculate this, please refer to GHG Protocol Scope 2 guidance. This grey cell calculates emissions. We then need to allocate these emissions to a sector. In this case, we will select stationary energy. The impact of these activities are displayed at the bottom of the page, in the net emissions summary. This table shows us our inventory data, but where information is added on net emissions, the reductions are shown in the central column and net totals reflected in the total net GHGs columns. Many cities find that they don't have information to enter on this sheet, as the programs accounted for are relatively rare. However, for those cities who have undertaken such investments, the ability to reflect the impact on their GPC inventory total can be very useful. Please note that as users work through the CIRIS tool, they may wish to take notes. The Notes section provides room to record important points of guidance to consider, components of the CIRIS tool that users may wish to find guidance for, or whatever else may come to mind, such as including a detailed description of the methodologies used.